Okay, well, our speaker today is Rebecca Nesbit, or Becky Nesbit. Becky is a science writer, and she's particularly interested in some of the ethical questions raised by science. She trained as an ecologist, and for her PhD she studied butterfly migration. I didn't really know that butterflies migrated. I just see them in my garden and, you know, I take them for granted. And she currently works for Science Nobel Prizes, and I just asked her what exactly that means. She doesn't work directly for the Nobel Committee, but there's a sponsorship organisation, and Becky goes around the world. I think her next trip is to Brazil, with current Nobel laureates, trying to inspire the laureates of the future. So it sounds like very exciting work. She also has written a book with an intriguing title, Is That Fish in Your Tomato? And this is all about exploring the risks and benefits of genetic modification. So I think we're in for a very interesting talk and afternoon, so will you please give Becky a big round of applause.
Thank you very much. How's that for volume? Good. When humans first arrived in Europe, they found giant polar bears, cave lions, woolly rhinoceros, and of course these are long since extinct, and many more species have followed, and we're now in a situation where an estimated 1 million species are threatened with extinction. The level of extinction is up to 1,000 times what we might expect based on the background rate in the fossil record. Which means that if this continues, then you and I are living through an event that's equivalent to the one which wiped out the dinosaurs. And we're not going to stop this. The level of funding that we are willing to commit to conservation is by no means going to reverse this trend. So what does that mean? In the past, the extinctions, what we've seen is a dip in the number of species followed by irradiation. And some people are suggesting that the diversity of life we see on Earth is courtesy of these extinction events. And there's no reason to think that the same won't happen this time, but that doesn't really help us now. There are potential huge implications on humans for extinction events. So how do we decide which species we're going to prioritise, and is extinction even what conservation should be thinking about? And in my talk I'm going to go through this thinking about an overarching guiding principle, and then discussing, well, what that might mean. And the answers aren't always clear, so I hope at the end we can have a bit of a discussion about what we do think this does mean. First, I'm going to give a bit of background to myself, just briefly. Yes, I studied butterfly migration, putting painted lady butterflies inside flight simulators. And if you want to ask me about any of this at the end, then please feel free. I then trained honeybees to detect explosives. I worked at the Royal Society of Biology in science communication, and also doing some policy work, for example, advising government on banning neonicotinoid pesticides. I work with the Nobel Prizes. I'm a trustee of the Galapagos Conservation Trust, and I've written a book all about GM foods, and I normally bring a few copies, but I've run out. So if you are interested, and then yes, I'm happy to answer any questions, and check it out on Amazon. I first came at the problem of conservation priorities from a scientific perspective. I studied painted ladies, and I'm sure that many of you will know that this year was incredible for painted ladies. Best since 2009, best since 1996. And what I've been seeing recently is newspaper articles about insect declines illustrated by pictures of painted lady butterflies. They're beautiful, they're at the top of our minds, but it's not very helpful, because the reason that we saw so many painted ladies this year is because they're migrants from Africa, which is incredible in itself, and the rainfall patterns in Africa meant that the caterpillars' food plants did very well, lots of caterpillars made it to adulthood, lots of butterflies made it to the UK. If we were to use our conservation money in the UK trying to help painted ladies, it would be a complete waste. Their population is driven by what's happening in Africa. So conservation needs to be driven by science. We need to know what works. But science isn't enough. Science can tell us what might happen if we do a particular thing, but it can't tell us the underlying values behind it. And in reality, humans have always made changes which mean some species become more common and some species become less common. I think a classic example is when humans started to replace forests with agricultural land. Trees, some species in particular, became less common. What we now think of as farmland flowers did very well. Prior to that, they would have been shaded out by trees. Meadows were an ideal habitat for them. And the values that our ancestors were using were simply that they wanted to eat and they wanted to feed their children. They didn't even know that these plants were going to become more common. We're in a very different situation. We do know what's going on, and the values we're driven by seem to often be our intuition. I took this picture at the Mall of America, and I don't know whether any of you have been to Minneapolis, but near the airport there is a giant shopping centre and theme park combined. It's like a monument to consumerism. It's quite a scary place. And quite incongruously, there was a stand here from the Nature Conservancy, which is one of America's largest conservation charities, and they had asked people to write on a post-it note, what does conservation mean to you? Save the ocean, I love roses, and it won't surprise you to hear that save the bees was very common. Nowhere was there save the wasps, nowhere was there save the hairworms. But if you dig a bit deeper and think about, well, what benefits do bees provide, and what benefits do wasps provide, then this is a very strange gut reaction, and probably one that needs to be analysed. Another thing I spotted at this stall is this question: what do you want tomorrow to look like? And I think that is an excellent question in terms of conservation, and in fact, in terms of the world. And this is one that I'll be coming back to. I'd like you to imagine that you're the very last person on Earth. And not only are there no other people, there are no other sentient creatures, nothing that can think or feel. On one of your dying days, you think to yourself, what I just love to do today, just for fun, is cut down the last remaining baobab tree, make a species extinct on a whim. Are you morally wrong? And what this is getting at is, does the value of a species still exist once there is nothing that their well-being will be affected by the absence of the species? Not just its use for someone or some animal, but its intrinsic value. And lots of people respond to this in a shocked way. Of course you're wrong, but that's very hard to justify philosophically. And to pick this apart, let's think about where do we allocate intrinsic value. This is me and my grandmother. I think we're probably all happy to say that we both have intrinsic value. We're not just valuable because we value each other, we're valuable because we exist. We have needs, and we will suffer if those are not met, and our suffering and our pleasure are morally relevant. This is my guinea pig. She is likewise valuable simply because she exists, not just because I value her. But she has experiences of the world, and she has needs which will cause her to suffer if not met. That is morally relevant. What about a species? Well, for a start, it's pretty clear that a species cannot suffer, cannot feel pleasure. If it doesn't have its needs met, there'll be no suffering involved. But when I say its needs, that's not even a very meaningful thing to say. What does a species want or need? Because given that 99.9% of all species which have ever existed have gone extinct, then maybe that's what species want, to go extinct. That's their ultimate fate anyway. So it's not really very meaningful to have an idea that a species wants something. We also have a problem of definitions. Scientists have over 40 ways of trying to define a species, but none of them work all the time. And if we take something like a bramble, we tend to refer to this as a species complex. They're so varied that it's hard to take one individual and say it belongs to a particular species. I do have the wrong species microphone. Am I making it any better?
That's okay. That's okay. It's all right. That's fine.
Back to brambles. There's no neat category that can allow us to put a bramble into a species. And that's not surprising, really, if we think about evolution and the fact that there's no magic moment when the parent is one species, the offspring is another. It's continuous. Why should we expect there to be neat categories of what a species is? And if species is really a sort of rough category developed by humans, why do we think it's morally relevant? Definitions get really hard when you get down to the level of bacteria. But if we really truly were saying that species have intrinsic value, then the mold which I've carefully been culturing in my kitchen, that species has exactly the same value as a rhinoceros. And that doesn't seem to be what is guiding conservation at the moment. And why have we chosen species? We could equally well have chosen subspecies or placed our value at the level of our genes or our genetic sequence. Maybe we think that because DNA exists in one sequence currently, that's got intrinsic value, we must make sure it's passed on to the next generation. But until recently, we didn't even know that DNA existed. And it's not how we perceive the world. We like to categorize based on what we can see, and that is species. So the fact that we've put our value at the level of the species isn't a comment on intrinsic value, it's a comment on how humans perceive the world. And what is it about a species which makes it valuable? Is it its DNA sequence? Because if that's the case, then it could happily live on in a zoo or even a seed bank. Is it something about its behavior or certain characteristics? Well then, maybe really we're assigning value at the level of that characteristic. It's quite hard to say what is the essence of a species that we value. And we have lots of examples now of humans changing species. I don't know whether any of you have blackcaps overwintering in your gardens now. And that is a genetic change caused by people feeding blackcaps. They have evolved so that they can spend the winter in the UK. Their migration routes have changed. Do we celebrate that because the species is adapting? Or do we say, no, we don't like that, their DNA sequence or something about that species has changed because of humans? We don't like it. But why do we think that humans can't influence a species? When did we decide that humans and nature were separate? All species have an impact on other organisms around them. As to humans, why is it somehow unnatural if humans influence other species? Humans have even created their own domestic species. Why is a species less valuable if it's domesticated and created by humans? And why have we even chosen to put our value in life? This photo was taken on Jeju Island in South Korea, and at the back, this is Mount Dan. It has bad feng shui because of its shape. In the West, we don't tend to put values in shapes. We don't say, this rock currently exists in this form, and therefore that shape should remain. But why is life different? Life has been shaped by natural forces. That stone has been shaped by natural forces. What is the difference? Some species have already, some conservationists have already moved beyond an interest in species and put their interest at the level of the ecosystem. But that too has challenges. Again, the ecosystem can't suffer. We don't really know what the needs of the ecosystem are. And when people going down that route, what they tend to do is think about how the ecosystem was in the past and assume that that's somehow what the ecosystem wants, whatever that might mean. But that means we are choosing a historical baseline. What baseline do we choose? In America, they often choose what ecosystems looked like when European settlers arrived. In the UK, we have really excellent records about bird numbers, and we often quote declines relative to the 1970s because that's when records began. I'm not sure that when records began or when European colonists found America make particularly good baselines. They're arbitrary, they're not morally relevant. And if we look further back, which people often do, and say we want to return ecosystems to what they looked like before humans were here, there are some practical problems with that. Not only that we can't, but we don't even know what they would have looked like if humans were here, because humans arrived in Europe, for example, at the end of the last ice age, and there was an interaction between human impacts and changing climate. We don't know what ecosystems would have looked like without us. And again, why should we care? Why do we think that humans are somehow unnatural and shouldn't be affecting the natural world? Another problem with our love of historic baselines is that we like to think the species belong somewhere. Humans have brought many species to the UK or spread them around the world. Some of them have been welcomed. We accept them as part of our natural flora and fauna, whereas some we don't like. We're not sure about parakeets in the UK. And there are many reasons why we don't want certain species which come to new places. They can become agricultural pests, for example. But that's not the same as saying they don't belong here. And that somehow, because this is only a recent change to their distribution, that's wrong. That we've set a historic baseline. If a species was there then it's fine. Again, morally arbitrary, it's an arbitrary baseline. So what conclusion have we come to? That there are no right answers. And anyone who thinks that they're being guided by science towards objective right answers just hasn't thought about the values they're employing. And some of the assumptions that conservation is currently based on fall down. Extinction should be halted because species have intrinsic value and ought to be there. Doesn't stand up. Species belong in their historic range. That's an arbitrary baseline, not morally relevant. Ecosystems should be returned to their past state. Again, when? Why? Human impact on nature should be reduced. There's no intrinsic reason why humans shouldn't alter the world around them just as every other species does. So we could come back to this question of what do we want tomorrow to look like? And I think none of us want the world tomorrow to look like this mining scene. We much prefer the beautiful mountain scene. However, we do want the products of mining. And if the whole world looked like this mountain scene, then what are we going to eat? Where are we going to farm? So how do we make these incredibly difficult trade-offs? Let's go back to what we think does have intrinsic value. People and sentient animals. And this is something we can discuss at the end, but seeing as humanists are making their ethical decisions guided by a concern for human beings and other sentient creatures, then I'm going to propose a utilitarian answer to this question of a world which maximizes the well-being of all people and sentient beings now and in the future. And in some ways, this supports current and traditional conservation practices, given the amazing services which nature provides. Take this mangrove, carbon sequestration, prevention of erosion, shade, habitat for fish, which then become food. You could go on with lists of how nature is essential to human life. And sometimes that means even in pure economic terms, we can justify conservation. It can be a lot cheaper to protect a marshland than to put up a concrete seawall. And this doesn't necessarily need to be nature in its past state. I think the Netherlands is a good example. They want to protect land which didn't even exist until humans made it. So what used to be the sea is now a marshland. It's not approaching any historic baseline, but it is nature thriving, being protected, and providing human benefits. But we should, of course, be wary about economic arguments and relying solely on making conservation pay, given how poor capitalism has been at supporting human welfare. And in particular, the poorest people tend to be the ones who rely most on nature. But if we move beyond GDP as a good indicator of what we want and look at well-being, then we can use human well-being to guide what conservation decisions we make. And I'm not simply talking in use terms, you know, what can we directly get from nature? What can we commodify? Nature has all sorts of benefits for mental health, for example, and studies showing things like hospital patients, even looking out of the window and seeing green space will help them recover more quickly. And I benefit just from knowing that nature exists. I've never been to the Galapagos, but I like knowing that these sea lions exist, that marine iguanas exist. And this is where I think some people get confused between intrinsic value and existence value. Intrinsic value, so existence value is simply, I want marine iguanas to exist. I value that that species isn't going extinct, but that is a human value and is my worldview. Whereas intrinsic value exists completely separate to humans. And this is a very important distinction, because if I were to say something like, I'd like rainforest to stay in its pristine state, then I don't have a trump card that rainforest should be exactly how it is. Think of the people who are maybe living in and around that patch of rainforest. Then I'm imposing my worldview of what I want that rainforest to look like, whereas they might be wanting to change it in a certain way. So I need to be aware that I'm coming forward with what I want for the world and what my worldview is, rather than some kind of absolute fact. The ecosystem should say how it is, or we must prevent that species extinction. And we're not just talking about people. We are also interested in the well-being of all sentient animals. And conservation currently has quite an awkward relationship with sentientism and animal welfare. If a bird of prey is shot in the British uplands, this is a tragic act of cruelty against an individual bird. If rats are causing a decline in native seabirds, well, then we need to get rid of the rats, even if they're going to take days dying from the poison. So sentientism and animal protection is used as an argument for conservation when it pleases conservationists. And sometimes it genuinely does support what's happening in conservation. But before we use it as an argument to protect nature, we have to remember that this Janowski's bunting, of which there are fewer than 1,000 remaining in the world, has exactly the same value as my garden robin and my friend Jenny's pet chicken. Part of thinking about animal welfare is, of course, answering the question, which animals are sentient? And I'm sure many of you are knowledgeable about this and have views on this. The question is quite hard to define. Not everyone sees sentience in the same way. Some people are interested in the ability to feel physical pain. Some people are thinking, is there anything it is like to be that animal? Any kind of awareness? And some people also say, well, we're interested in, can they have positive and negative mental states? We argue about what the question means. We certainly argue about the answer. In Animal Liberation, Singer suggested that we draw the line somewhere between a shrimp and an oyster. And he suggests that's as good a place as any to draw the line, and I only used his quote because it's as good as one as any. There's lots of ambiguity, lots of debate, but I'm actually not enormously interested in the nitty-gritty of can octopuses, can crabs feel pain? Because I think with conservation we are so far from being able to know not only the answers to that question, but actually what would it mean for us? How could we improve the welfare of wild crabs? I think we're a long way from answering that question. So I'm more interested in focusing on what that might mean for vertebrates, particularly for mammals and birds. How can conservation take their well-being into account? I've got another thought experiment for you. This time, you're quite hungry when you stumble across a fox who is chasing a rabbit. As luck would have it, you have 2 vegan meals with you. What do? You could eat one vegan meal and give one to the fox. You could eat a vegan meal, let the fox catch the rabbit. Or you could eat the rabbit and give a vegan meal to the fox. Which sounds a bit stupid initially, but probably a human is able to kill a rabbit with less suffering than a fox would cause by trying to kill the rabbit. So from the rabbit's perspective, it would probably rather that you went for number 3. And if you only have one vegan meal and you have to choose between 2 and 3, the answer you give might be based on the worldview you're coming from. In that the animal rights movement is interested in things like the fact that it is wrong to kill animals. Whereas from the animal welfare movement, they take a different perspective and they want the well-being of that animal to be maximised. So someone interested in animal rights would probably say, then you've got to let the fox take the rabbit. Someone interested in animal welfare would say, that will cause the rabbit to suffer more, you should be the one to kill the rabbit. And the movements just slowly building up in conservation include compassionate conservation, which has grown out of the animal rights movement and says things like, we should never kill a wild animal. And welfare consequentialism, which pushes back up against that and said, well, actually, sometimes we are causing suffering by not killing animals. Surely that's wrong. Ways we harm animals. They're quite extensive, and this is by no means all of them. Direct killing is perhaps the most obvious for all sorts of reasons, some pro-conservation, some anti-conservation. And protection here includes protection of human life and protection of property. Keeping wild animals in captivity. An alarming number of wild animals are kept in captivity, including in America primates. And zoos cause a lot of controversy, both questioning their motives. The proponents say that people who see animals in a zoo setting are more likely to show pro-conservation behaviours, but actually that doesn't seem to stack up. That hasn't really been proven. Hard to prove, but a bit dubious. Direct harm, for example, by building infrastructure. We're maybe destroying habitat to build a road. The animals that were living there are displaced. Plus the more subtle ecological changes that occur as a result of things like building infrastructure. The habitats that did house lots of animals no longer do. Things have changed. One of the ways that we are changing ecological systems is by introducing new species. In the UK, a classic example is the grey squirrel, which is displacing the red squirrel. And a large part of the reason for that is that grey squirrels don't suffer from squirrel pox, but they are carriers. And they have spread it to red squirrels. So not only are there ecological consequences of that, but far more obviously, there are animal welfare consequences as the red squirrels died from squirrel pox. Climate change, we only have to look at the horrifying situation in Australia at the moment to see how that can harm animals. Air pollution, no surprise given that it affects us, it affects wild animals too. And anyone who drove here today, particularly if you came from outside Bournemouth, probably saw an animal dead at the side of the road. These are just a few of the ways we harm wild animals. Probably things like changing ecological systems have a far greater impact. There are now far fewer wild animals in existence than there were 20 years ago, than 40 years ago. But that's not really where any animal welfare debate is currently focused. It's focused more on things like direct killing. In particular, trophy hunting. And this is where someone kills a wild animal, basically something that they can brag to their friends about. They can put the antlers on their wall or their picture on Instagram. Tends to be lions, for example, big cats, or something like an antelope with impressive horns or an unusual coloration. It's not anything like the largest cause of death of wild animals, even of lions. In the world each year, it's hard to know, but roughly 250 lions are killed for trophy hunts each year, which is very small compared to lions killed for other reasons. But it does mean that it can provide an economic incentive and opportunity to protect game parks, to protect a natural habitat. Is that okay? That one American is able to come into Africa, pay a lot of money to kill a lion, and that one animal dies, but for the greater good, for the species, for the many individuals which are protected as a result of the funds paid to kill the lion. And how does this differ from sport hunting? It gets a lot more attention than, for example, game bird shooting in the UK, moose hunting in Norway, which are common cultural practices. Is that different? And is it different to hunting for food? And what are the welfare implications of hunting for food? Actually, maybe a deer or kangaroo shot from the wild had a much better life than a cow raised in captivity. If we're going to eat meat, maybe we should be promoting killing of wild meat. Conservation is responsible for lots of killing, in particular non-native species such as rats, possums, which have been introduced into a new area, become very common, often at the expense of native species, or maybe they've changed habitats. Is it okay to kill rats which are eating chicks, causing welfare implications? Is it okay to kill rats because you're worried about a species going extinct, either globally or locally? can you kill individuals to protect the greater good, however you define the greater good to be? Is the method of killing important? At the moment, conservation uses some potentially dubious techniques. For example, they have the Judas method, whereby in particularly Australia, they incapacitate a donkey. It's not sedated, but it's paralysed, which attracts more feral donkeys, and that's an easy way to find donkeys to kill. But some of the supposed humane methods also have concerns. It might feel much nicer if you use a humane mousetrap and move the mouse to somewhere else, but there's a pretty high chance that that mouse is going to die, and just much more slowly. You've introduced it into an environment where maybe it's someone else's territory, they maybe don't know where to get food, they may well not survive in that new environment, and that was a slower way to die than if it had just been killed one-off in a mousetrap. So even these supposedly humane methods do require some further thought. And why do we accept killing some species and not others? In the UK, we've got two non-native parakeets, the rose-ringed parakeet, which is very, very common. I don't know whether it's here in Bournemouth, and the monk parakeet, which is less common. So early on, the government thought, well, we can stop the monk parakeet becoming established, the population's very low. That failed because there was a public outcry. People didn't want shooting parakeets. How many rats do you think are trapped each day in London? But, of course, that's fine. But these beautiful birds that we're seeing in our gardens, we don't want killed. We might need to standardise a bit what we think about which animals can be killed, how and why. And in fact, even if you think about some of the language used, invasive species, vermin, pests, war on invasive species, that can legitimise the killing of animals, sometimes in inhumane ways. They're seen as lesser simply because of the language we use to describe them. But we don't just want to think about lack of suffering. What about if we want positive welfare outcomes as well? Could we really be more ambitious for conservation and about designing a world that was for the good of animals? All sorts of things have been suggested. What I'm going to do now is go through a load of them, and then at the end I'm going to bring this slide up as I think it will trigger discussion. Some of them are as you'd expect, some of them are wacky, and most of them are contradictory. We could let nature take its course. Partly we might think, well, we just know so little about what it is like to be an animal. We're probably going to get it wrong. Why don't we let nature go on as it always has? Or we could take a slightly different approach to arguing this and say that it's just wrong for humans to have domination over animals and try and work out what is best for animals. Even if we might be reducing suffering by intervening, somehow we are affecting that animal's dignity. So that would be more from the animal rights movement rather than the animal welfare movement that would use that argument. Completely to the contrary, we could manage world populations, for example, by providing supplementary feed or water, and by killing ill individuals. A particularly famous example comes from a Dutch nature reserve, who I'm not going to try and pronounce the name, but you might have heard of it. There was controversy because they had a large number of herbivores, including horses, and they became very common and exceeded the carrying capacity. And then one winter, about a third of them were in danger of starving to death. People started throwing hay bales over the fence of the nature reserve so that the horses could eat. And eventually, what was decided in future years is that the animals should be culled. Animals that don't look like they're going to survive the winter are shot to save this slow starvation. Some people would say, well, much better than humans doing this killing, why don't we introduce predators? And that would be controlling the herbivore populations. Whereas other people say, well, surely we should reduce predation. It's a pretty nasty way to die. There would be lots of people in favour of abolishing zoos. However, zoos have, in some situations, conservation roles. Many of the most critically endangered species have captive breeding programs. How much do animals, as part of this captive breeding program, suffer? Is that okay to prevent an extinction, for example? And when, in what situations and what species suffer more in captivity than they do in the wild? Because we could actually say, bring all wild animals into captivity, then we can protect them from things like cold. Is an animal life a good one? Particularly because so many animals die soon after birth, and there's a lot of suffering in nature. Does suffering predominate in nature? Are most animal lives not worth living? So should we pave over our gardens so that fewer animals ever live? Or maybe we think we do want animal life, and we should therefore maximise the natural habitat to maximise the number of animals. And if we're going to do that, there might be a conflict between human needs and animal needs. If we want more area for wildlife, we need to take less for ourselves. And this point is very complex and has two questions in it. One, how do we weigh up the needs of humans and animals? And two, how do we weigh up the needs of humans? If we go back to our point about we want a world which maximises the well-being of humans and animals, how do we compare the humans and the animals? And do we think that in that case, maybe we want as many humans as possible? How do we weigh up having as many humans as possible, but humans leading good lives? Should we be trying to reduce our consumption, or so that there can be more people, or should we be trying to reduce the number of people? At what point does our welfare become compromised if we reduce our consumption? We could focus on primate conservation if we think that the species with the greatest capacity for sentience are the ones that we most want to survive into the future, maybe even after humans are gone. And this is the most outrageous. What about if we use gene editing to reprogram predators as herbivores? And there was also a suggestion that some animals have loads of offspring and most die. Could we reprogram those to have fewer offspring so that more of them live? And I think technologically and certainly ecologically, we're not really there yet. That one's not going to work. However, I think it is a good, sort of almost a thought experiment. Well, would that be an appropriate thing to do, to change nature so much if we thought that that could reduce animal suffering? So before I open all this to the floor, I just wanted to conclude by thinking about what we can do. Of course, we can change our lifestyle. Given, for example, the carbon emissions that food thrown away is responsible for, we could maybe throw less food in the bin. We could also change our diets to be more plant-based, given in general how much more land is required to produce meat or dairy than to produce crops. Then absolutely there will be more space for nature if we use less of it growing food that either goes in the bin, gets eaten by us when we don't need it, or gets fed to livestock. And of course, we grow our clothes as well. reducing the number of clothes you buy. Talking about the issues, the kind of things we've discussed today, and questioning people when people say things like, let's save the planet. Does the planet need saving? What do they really mean? And probably if you ask conservationists what they are trying to achieve, the chances are they won't give you a very good answer. They'll have made assumptions, and they won't even know that the conservationist next to them they work with has made a different assumption. So it's great to have these conversations with friends and family, and with people who are working in the conservation community. And spend time in nature, which I know you do through your walks. That if we want more benefits from nature, we don't just need more nature, we need to make use of those benefits. For example, by going out into nature, and I think the increased well-being from spending time in nature will be much greater than any increased well-being from consuming the kind of things which destroy nature. I just have a few acknowledgements for people who have shaped my ideas and provided information and photographs, and in particularly the British Geological Society. And thank you for listening.
Thank you very much, Becky. Lots of food for thought there. And apologise for the sort of feedback on the microphone there. So we obviously need to get that looked at. Bill?
I was going to suggest when you ask the questions, when you ask the questions, maybe use this. Maybe Becky could use this one, and I'll pass, or at least Pat will pass the green one around.
Yeah, okay, so Pat is going to pass a green microphone around, and just a little training session for you now. When you get the microphone in front of you, just hold it pretty much as I'm holding this one now, pointed towards your mouth. So, do we have any questions for Becky? Yes, Paul is first.
Hello, Becky, thank you for that. I may have missed some of the implicit messages in your talk. It seems to me that you've taken farming practices pretty much as given. And it seems to me that for all sorts of good and bad reasons, farming has done terrible damage in the arena we're talking about. Clearly there are caring farmers and uncaring farmers. Clearly there are caring policies and there are uncaring policies. I know that we all like to eat, but I'm very surprised that you've given them such an easy ride.
Sorry, could you repeat that last? Is it, why have I given farmers such an easy ride?
Well, yes, it seems to me a very big dead elephant in the room that we might like to comment about in this context.
Absolutely, and is this in environmental destruction of habitat terms or in animal welfare terms?
Both.
Both.
Hedgerows, pesticides, water courses.
Yeah, exactly. All. Well, yeah. There are many problems caused by farming, but also farming has allowed this incredibly large human population. And if we think human lives are a good thing, then we should be thinking, this is amazing, we have so many humans. Farming has allowed this. One of my favourite debates, which you may be familiar with, is land sharing versus land sparing. With one school of thought saying that actually organic farming is bad for the environment. And what we should be trying to do is grow as much food as possible on a smaller area of land. So we should be trying to increase yields. Yes, maybe this involves pesticides, all sorts of intensive methods, but that will allow us to spare more land for nature. And if your motivation is to reduce extinction, then that seems to be the better strategy. That do what you like to the smallest possible area of land, but save more land in, or it's closer to a natural situation. And that's a very interesting way of looking at things, but it brings us back to the question of, well, what do we want? Do we want to prevent extinctions? Actually, maybe we think, well, we would all like to be in a much less intensively farmed environment where we see hedgerows, we see birds, we see bees. The fact that maybe some Amazon rainforest is being saved because we're farming intensively here, well, we're still losing some of the benefits from the nature around us. So that's a very complex debate, including in policy terms. As you say, there's good policies, bad policies. In theory, yes, if we were to have this high-intensity farming, do what you like, then that would save more land for nature, but in practice it could well mean that we just throw more food in the bin. So my overall point there is, yes, farming has changed the world in many ways, but it has given us amazing things in return, and that some of the debates, for example, if we were to ban pesticides, we would have serious problems, not only with feeding people, but also serious environmental problems if we, for example, had to convert more land or had to use less sustainable alternatives. So some of these bad things going on are for a good reason. But as you say, there are some bad practices. We have the knowledge to farm in a more environmentally friendly way, and we don't. And there are all sorts of barriers to that. We eat food that is so incredibly cheap, and that is fantastic because people on the breadline can sometimes afford to eat. But really, the proportion of my salary that I pay on food is incredibly low. How can we really be accounting for all the environmental damage when I am paying for food, and would that stop people throwing so much food away and treating it so carelessly? Would that, as you say, allow farmers to, if farmers weren't operating on such small profit margins, they might be able to farm differently, not just because they'd have more money to use different practices, but one of the reasons that farmers are resistant to reducing the number of herbicides they use is not that they know that overall it would reduce their costs, but sometimes it would also increase their vulnerability. Some yields, or particularly pesticides, some yields, you're spraying pesticides and actually the pests don't come, you wasted your money. But some years, if you don't spray the pesticides, then you lose your crop. So on average, they might be better off not using the pesticides, but they can't afford to have that one bad year where they lose their crop completely or their yields are reduced. So if farmers weren't operating on such a low profit margin, maybe they'd be able to afford to, for example, not use pesticides.
I thought it was a very interesting talk. This is starting to work. Coming and going. Hello, hello. Came in it went. So, what I'm saying is that fascinating talk. It seems quite an academic, philosophical look at whether there's really a moral justification for some decisions rather than others. You highlighted the extraordinary level of anthropomorphism, where I just made a list of sort of animals we love. Panda, the koala, clownfish, the lark we write poems to, the seal, and obviously our cats and dogs. So we have this sort of huge, rather false emotional investment, one might say, from whatever aspects of our humanity. But can I ask you a technical question? We've heard quite a lot recently about a potential drastic reduction in the world's insect population. And these are obviously not little creatures that most of us waste too much emotion on. But is there a real threat to the survival of human beings from the destruction of microlife, which we may not know that we rely on?
Yeah, absolutely. Insect Armageddon. That's a fascinating and challenging area, as you might expect. First of all, the reports about insect declines are quite varied, and we don't really know to what level these insect declines are occurring, as you can imagine. But yes, let's take it as read as insects are declining. The kind of thing that insects do for us include pollination. That's the most famous cited one. And people tend to overestimate how much we get from pollinators. There is this fact going around that 1 in 3 of your mouthfuls is courtesy of bees, and that's a load of rubbish. It's probably more like 5 to 10% of our food comes as a direct result of animal pollination. And these tend to be very nutritious, high-value foods, beans, fruits, for example, so they're very important for micronutrients. But basically, we don't rely on pollinators to feed the population. We can still feed people based on, for example, wind-pollinated crops. So sometimes some of the roles are overestimated, but yes, I'm sure, and also some of all insects are not contributing equally to that pollination, and that declines in numbers can be, in some situations, more important than declines in diversity. We could lose a lot of our insect species and still be fine. But pollination is just one aspect, and I think there are also all sorts of, as you say, sort of microlife that we don't even talk about. No one even says. There's no nematode worm Armageddon news stories. There's no bacteria Armageddon news stories. I'm sure you're right that there is just so much that we rely on in so many different ways. We don't understand it. We don't know what the knock-on effect is going to be. And one of my favourites is parasites. Parasites do so much for us, but I've been hunting down, I'd be interested to know if anyone knows of one, a conservation scheme for a parasite.
Can I just ask a follow-up question, Becky, about that? Is there a simple correlation between the decline in insects and decline in birds? Or is it more complicated than that?
It's more complicated than that, partly because not all birds are insectivorous. And that some birds are doing fine. There's also a correlation and causation issue here, in that some of the things that are causing the insect population to decline is also causing bird populations to decline. So I think that answer can be summarised as, to some extent, but not completely.
Thank you. So, do we have some more Sally? And,
the Dorset Wildlife Trust sent me a magazine just before Christmas and announced excitingly that they were planning to introduce a pair of beavers to Dorset, and would I like to help sponsor them? And that did sound to me like a nice idea. What do you think?
My in-laws happen to also be a member, so I saw the magazine too. Sounded pretty exciting. Yes, without knowing the ins and outs, beavers do a huge amount to modify the environment, generally in a positive way. So I would say this is a very good scheme. Exactly who it will go on to impact and how isn't always clear, But even the fact that I think it's going to capture imaginations, lots of people are going to get a lot of pleasure from knowing that these beavers exist. I think that in itself is a good enough reason to say, yeah, welcome them.
Hello. Common theme running through your talk seems to be having your cake and eating it. We seem to want our lives to be enriched. We want food, we want transport, we want movies, we want everything. We think everybody in the world should enjoy this. We have no real way of limiting our growth, which is exponential. We live in a hugely integrated environment where small changes in starting conditions, like introducing beavers, have absolutely unpredictable outcomes. And the bottom line is that we are a species rampant. We are a scourge, a pest on the earth. We are uncontrollable and highly destructive. And this seems to be a sort of the elephant in the room. We try and tweak nature to suit our sensibilities, what we think is pretty, what we like to see in nature, the walks we go on, the butterflies we see. But we're pretty well blind to the overall pattern, of which we are a dreadful mistake, if you would put it that way.
I see your friend wants to. Do you want to add to that before I respond?
Sorry, you're talking about me?
Yeah. Was that okay? Just point yourself.
One of the things you pulled out.
Sure, yeah, just take the mic and then we'll add that.
I'll try to operate this in a responsible fashion. Okay. It seems to me, listening to your talk, which is very, very interesting. Oh, so sorry. Okay, can you hear me better? Every mic. Okay. I want to compliment you on your excellent talk. It raised so many interesting issues. I mean, you've brought up about at least 60, 70, 80 really important issues. But I would just like to point out, or bring to everybody's attention, one particular underlying factor, which I think is by far the most important underlying factor. And it's the underlying factor which is responsible for the fact that we have all these issues to worry about. And that is our uncontrolled world population. If we could somehow control or reduce the world's population, the majority of the issues you brought up would not be issues, or if they were issues, they'd be very, very much less significant and threatening. You didn't say a great deal about uncontrolled human population, but that is the underlying reason why these are issues. And why we are now forced to address them. So, how do I say it? Thank you. Such an important and controversial and fascinating discussion, which I always feel people say is the elephant in the room, but actually I find people talking about it a lot. Where to start? One is, again, fascinating to think about our use of language. Out of control, uncontrolled growth. That's putting a value judgment when we could simply say something like exponential growth, even though that is changing. There has been a period of exponential growth, high numbers of humans. And we have absolutely changed the world, in some cases to the detriment of other humans and to animals. But I think we have to come back to what do we want tomorrow to look like, and maybe say goodbye to some of our feelings of, as you say, we want the world to look pretty to our needs. Say goodbye to some of our feelings of this is how the world should look like, and somehow humans are destroying the world. Are we, in that statement, putting value in anything other than a sentient being? And if that is the case, then do we really mean to do that? And I would argue we don't have, that we shouldn't be placing our value in anything other than a sentient being. It's quite easy for me to say we should reduce the human population, being well aware that
I consume a lot of resources. Wouldn't your ideal, and this is a question, so my ideal would be a high human population because I think human lives are a good thing, or in theory could be a good thing. My ideal world that I would like to see would be a world with a high but happy human population. That's very, very challenging, and I think we at the moment have a high but unhappy human population, and what we are doing now is going to impact not just others around the world, but others in the future. So should I not be thinking, all these people around me, we're all, as a Western society, just consuming so much. It's bad for our well-being, it's bad for the well-being of others. It's quite easy to say we should reduce the human population, but wouldn't it be superior to change the way we lived and live happier, less resourceful lives? We have some strong nods and strong no's. Let's hear what people think.
Would you like to? Oh, yeah. Let's get the mic to you, because the gentleman here was telling me earlier that you keep bees, so you might want to talk about that as well. Say something about the humans first. Yes, okay.
Can you hear me? Yes, you can. Yeah, I disagree with you on the pollination values. If you're talking about honeybees, I would agree, but there are 26,000 different bees in the world, and that excludes all the other pollinators. But coming on to the question of population, you have to include in that question economics, capitalism, consumerism, and nowhere, even within the UN, have they calculated what the human carrying capacity is related to what is sustainable. Whatever the value system is on determining what is sustainable, nobody has a figure. What is the carrying capacity for England, Wales or Scotland, when each of those countries have different agricultural systems, different terrains and what they could support. So unless you calculate what is the value of capitalism, consumerism and population, how can you ever get question.
Shall I try?
We're obviously having difficulties with the mic.
Does that work? Oh, it does work. This is the better microphone. I was just trying to pose the question that unless you have a value system, whatever that is on what sustainability is, you can't determine what a carrying capacity is of a country to know what is sustainable, and then you have to bring in economics, capitalism, consumerism, because that drives the need for us to consume what's on the planet. So, there's these four things that link together, and everything underneath is saving a rat or saving a blue whale is just to pay Greenpeace executives more money.
So a few points in there, and I'll just make sure I've understood them correctly. On the pollination point, it's incredibly difficult to estimate, but the estimates do tend to vary between 5 and 12%. It's quite a lot. It is exactly, and it's around the world, but there is so there's a lot of uncertainty, but a lot of work has been done on how much insects contribute to human food production, and it is within that range. That's what the scientific literature says. Though, yeah, it's very variable based on crops, for example. I can use my fact that in every talk I give, I can say, oh, I can't use this fact for much longer because it's about proportion of EU cropland that is insect pollinated is 12%. And I keep thinking, we're going to leave the EU before I do my next talk, but we don't. So maybe this time it is the last use. So in the EU, 12% of cropland is pollinated by insects, but that doesn't mean 12% of our food production is courtesy of insects, because there are things like oilseed rape which still produce a yield even if there's no animal pollination. But the interesting points about which can almost be summarised as, can we do it? That it, particularly as we are a capitalist society and no one anywhere in the world has shown what looks like a sustainable society, that and my ideal sustainable society would be sustaining high human well-being in perpetuity. We're not great at high human well-being now, we're certainly not great at high human well-being in perpetuity. So was your point basically that it's just impossible, that you don't see a world where that is happening?
What is the carrying capacity of that?
And I would say that is a question with no answer, because it depends on so many things. On, for example, what new technologies we produce, what, how much each person wants to consume, because there is this relationship between what our lives look like and how many people the world can support. We can only answer that question in the context of what our lives are going to be. And I think, what's the carrying capacity of the world? It depends on how we're going to live. And also depends on climate change, and on ongoing soil degradation, for example. I think it is a question with no answer, but that doesn't mean we shouldn't try and work towards a world we want.
Okay, we've got a couple of people waiting. John, then David and Deborah, so we've got 3 to get through. Let's use this one, and then we'll give you a chance to think of your answer. Yeah, John first.
Does the focus on action to tackle climate change, is that the best way of preserving our species in the future? Or does the focus on tackling climate change means that these trendy issues of conservation are just going to be forgotten for the next 30, 40 years?
Yeah, very difficult one. And again, it depends on what is going to be the impact of our focus on climate change. Are we going to end up talking a lot about it and not really achieving emissions reductions? Are we going to put lots of money into saving, protecting one species in one area, and actually climate change means that area is no longer suitable for it, and it was a complete waste of time? So I think we can't see these two things as separate. They're interconnected in so many ways. For example, protecting the forest, carbon storage, on a feedback loop, both what we do in conservation will increase or decrease climate change, and what we do for climate change will impact what conservation works and doesn't. In terms of where should we focus? Should we focus on transformational change? Should we say that all this tweaking around the edges, let's have a captive breeding program, let's make more efficient cars, it's just not going to work. Should we say we want a transformational change in the way that humanity lives, and we tackle both these things together? I don't know, but I wish I did.
Okay, let's get to David. Let's take that one here. David.
Yeah, it seems to me that in the ecosystem you're either predator or prey. And in our case, we've become this super predator, and we've developed this marvellous technique of destroying the habitat of other creatures. No other creature seems to have done that. I might be wrong, but we seem to have this wonderful habit of destroying the environment, and other creatures don't. If they destroy if elephants eat too much, they die off, and their population would restore itself. This doesn't quite work with humans. We would then go and attack the next lot of humans and take over their territory and kill them off. So, any comments on that?
Yeah, predator, prey, or parasite. Yes, every species affects the habitats of other species, sometimes making them better, sometimes worse. The beaver is a classic example. It builds dams, which floods behind it. The species that were living there before get flooded out, not great for them, but then there's a pool which other species can live in. So every species, particularly those that are habitat engineers, have a profound impact on other species, positive and negative, just as humans have had a profound impact, positive and negative. Some species, unfortunately we often call them pests or weeds, have done very, very well as a result of humans. Some have declined. And plenty of, I think your elephant example was a good one. All sorts of species do destroy their environment and go in cycles. And back in the, when we were talking about animal welfare, we realised that we don't really like that because animals starve to death. Are we going to go in a cycle? And is that going to be a lot of suffering because the human population crashes? Unfortunately, I think probably that is going to be what happens without being able to predict the future. So really the question is it a bad thing, and should humans behave differently? It's not somehow unnatural for one species to modify the habitats of other species. It's not somehow unnatural because humans are separate from nature. However, in lots of what we're doing, it's unwise. That is for specific reasons, like if I destroy this, then some humans or animals will suffer, rather than I'm changing that makes it wrong. Does that answer your question?
Excellent. Okay, let's go to Deborah. Deborah, just pop your hand up so that Pat knows where to bring the mic.
I've just come back from Philippines. We're talking about human values. They're a very poor society, but they are very, very happy people, the happiest people I've ever come across. And I've just travelled extensively now in the Far East. I just think they've got it right and we've got it wrong. That's and it ties in. You don't see obesity in Philippines because they are poor, but they're happy people. I think they've got the right values and they're very family orientated. But they do have large families because it's predominantly a Catholic country. I think we could take a lot of these people, really do. Sorry.
I want to come back on that.
I think that's back to our point of transformational change and how could we have a human population that is high and happy. And yeah, I think you're right. We can look to other cultures to say, well, where have we got it wrong?
Yeah, we got it wrong. Okay, let's go back to Jeremy.
Try to use this thing.
It's easy now.
Just point it out.
Yes, okay. All right. Am I audible?
Yes.
Okay. I didn't. The lady behind me who talked about this primitive culture of very happy people. I didn't hear which culture or society or country. Philippines. Okay. All right. Philippines. Thank you for that. Would you say that there is a direct correlation between happiness and well-being? Because earlier on in your talk, you were emphasising, the issue of well-being. But if we do attach cardinal importance to so-called well-being, how do we assess well-being? Can it be correlated with happiness? Or should it be determined purely in, let's say, economic terms or psychological terms, which in turn are related to happiness, obviously? So the whole issue becomes very philosophical. Thank you.
I think this is the fundamental question, really. If we're going to try and make a world with more well-being, what do we mean? Some of the academic literature on this would separate this out into hedonic well-being, which is maybe what we'd think of happiness. I'll eat a chocolate biscuit today and I'll feel really good. And eudonic, which is more about feeling fulfilled. On the train, I might be eating a chocolate biscuit, but also thinking, I really felt that was a valuable discussion after our talk, which I did. But also life satisfaction. So I might be thinking, oh yeah, so my life is going well, and that might be because I get to eat chocolate biscuits and I get to feel a sense of purpose. It's different in different cultures. In the East, they tend to more think suffering is a part of life, whereas in the West, we tend to not really want that. So, sort of suffering and hard work is something we're trying to avoid. In the East, they more accept it. So yes, well-being is incredibly hard to define, and I would love to see more people having conversations about what well-being is, how they can maximise it for themselves, how we can maximise it for the world. But I also think that the difficulty in defining it isn't a reason not to have it as a goal.
I'll run another happiness course. The full title of my happiness course is the science, psychology and philosophy of happiness, well-being and something else. But anyway, so it covers all the bases. Right, we've got time for... Right, 4 hands have gone up. We're going to have to be very quick now because we're going to run out of time. So we've got Paul, another Paul. You're not Paul, are you? No. Kathy and Susan. So please be quick with your questions, and if I can ask you to be quick with your answers as well. Yeah. So we can take them all together. So Paul, Susan, and Kathy.
Thank you very much. Good talk. Excellent. I totally agree with Barry. The problem we've got is that as humans we're so conceited and full of ourselves we forget that we're only an animal the same as the others, but we have far more power, and on top of that we take up far too much of the benefits of the earth. We cover it with concrete for houses, and we all have to have 2 or 3 bedrooms and things like that, compared with other people who live in one single mud hut. And the point is, why should we take the attitude that we have to look after this for the humans, for the happiness of humans? We don't care about the happiness of an animal. We don't think, oh, that little snail there is really happy. We don't even consider it. So the whole point of the thing is balance. There's far too many humans on this planet, far too many. It's got to be a balanced thing to sustain animals, plants and everything else. I mean, people say, oh, we shouldn't eat animals, we go vegetarian. But who's to say that when we cut that cabbage off, he isn't in pain? Nobody knows. So you should say you're killing a plant. So where do you draw the line?
Okay,
I think the answer is to cut down on the population.
Let's move on to your question. Thank you. Before we go too deeply into questions.
Yeah, I was just going to make the point really, we seem to be unique as a species, that we've set ourselves up globally so that the natural forms of population control, like disease, viruses, things like that, we've actually set ourselves up so we can actually transmit those all around the planet within 24 hours. No other species has done that. Every other species is quite separate. So the rabbit gets a disease here, one in Australia won't get it unless we move it across. So I think nature will take care of us just like it's taken care of everything else. Yes. There's lots of history to support that.
Okay, pass to Susan.
Well, that was a brilliant talk. Thank you very much indeed. It made me think about loads of things I've never thought of before. A philosopher, Mark Fisher, said, life is a catastrophe, but the solution is suicide. And I just am with you in thinking that it's worth, I don't know how, but I like being alive. And I think a lot of people do. And the way we're talking, there are a lot of people who care about animals and other people. And I don't think we should be quite as gloomy.
Thank you, Susan.
Well, this is rather gloomy, carrying on, Susan. It's been almost facetious. Right at the end of your talk, you said one of the things we could do for human well-being was to go out into nature. But if 5,000 people from a small town all go out into nature, we'll ruin the farms, we'll ruin the habitats. Just a comment. You can never win.
Okay, I've got 1 minute to cover all of that. Thank you for that note of happiness, because yes, I do often think, oh dear, nature is going to take care of us and I'm not going to like it. But yeah, I'm glad to be alive. I think lots of people are glad to be alive, and I therefore don't want to dismiss humanity as a species, and I would like us to keep going. And this, fascinating point, how do we weigh up a human life versus an animal life? Currently it's very swayed in favour of human lives. Yes, science is a long way from answering the question of, is a snail sentient? However, I personally am very comfortable in saying that a human life is worth more than a snail's life, because I'm sufficiently confident that snail sentience is not equivalent to human sentience, and if I think human life is a good thing because of the pleasure I get from it, then I am happy to say that gives my life value that a snail's life doesn't have.
Very selfish.
I'm standing by it.
Do you want to follow up on anything else?
And, if everyone is satisfied by those answers, then I am too.
I'm